We're in the year of 2024. Now, let's bring one of the fundamental concepts into our table, which is the word democracy. Now, if you remember correctly, back in 2023, when we initially talked about the word democracy, so much took place. For example, not only we'll look at this political polarization in the US, and also at the same time, the whole world paid attention to two major wars. One is the war in Ukraine, and also the other one is the war in Israel. Now, fast forward, we are in the year of 2024. How should we redefine the concept of democracy? Now, if you remember back in the days that when we talk about the word democracy, or even understand the simple structure of democratic system, it's beyond the voters' rights, it's beyond inequality, it's actually, guess what, to preserve peace and stability, not just only within the cities, within the countries. As a matter of fact, it's the mission for the entire world. Well, that's not really the case today. Again, if you follow the news, for the year 2024, we continue to follow the war in Ukraine. On one hand, people in the country still suffer from this invasion of Russia, but meanwhile, the current ruthless leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, make no signals of stopping the war. As a matter of fact, some scholars believe that Russia today is quietly transforming some of the occupied territories of Ukraine. And how should we understand that? And do we believe that Ukraine today is willing to negotiate, or is there even a possibility for the two countries to settle down for a decent negotiation? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Professor David Lewis. Professor Lewis teaches and researches on international relations and peace and conflict studies, with additional strands of research focusing on the politics of authoritarian states. In regional terms, most of his research has explored post-Soviet politics, notably in Russia and Central Asia. Well, Professor Lewis, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Well, Professor, the pleasure is all mine. Now, as mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you recently wrote, which is entitled The Quiet Transformation of Occupied Ukraine. Now, before we get to a further conversation, let's talk about the reality. Now, going back to the article that you mentioned that Russia remained in control of almost 18% of the Ukrainian territory, including about 25,000 square miles of land seized since February 2012. At this moment, what do we make of the progress that both made by Ukraine and also Russia? And again, let's answer the first question. Is it time that really for the international community to come up with a feasible solution so we don't have to see any more sufferings for the nation of Ukraine? Your thoughts?
Yes, I think you have to start from what Russia intended to do in February 2022, which was to take over much larger parts of Ukraine and indeed to overthrow the current government in Ukraine and probably put in place a more pro-Russian administration. So in terms of Russia's strategic goals in the war, their actual achievements have been rather limited, and they hold on to this relatively small part of Ukraine in the southeast, these four provinces in the southeast that they claim to have annexed, although they don't control them fully militarily. And part of that territory, of course, they controlled directly or indirectly, even before 2022. So in many ways, Ukraine has been quite successful on the battlefield, pushing Russian forces out of the north, the northeast, and from part of the south in Kherson Oblast, where they had big victories in late 2022. But as we know, in the last year, there's been very little shift really on the front line. So in territorial terms, you have a kind of not quite a stalemate because there's still a lot of fighting going on the front line, but you have, you might say, a kind of equilibrium between the two Russian forces, between the Russian and Ukrainian forces on the land. There's a slightly different war going on at sea, a maritime war in which Ukraine has been more successful, despite the fact that it doesn't really have a navy. It's been able to push the Russian fleet back in the Black Sea and been quite successful with drones and other types of attacks on Russian ships. And then, of course, you have this other aerial war in which Russia is bombing and sending missiles into Ukrainian cities. And Ukraine is also starting to respond with these drone attacks on Russia. So giving a sort of overall assessment of the war is quite difficult because you've got these different domains that are going on at the same time. So although it seems like a deadlock on the front line, it's actually still a very dynamic conflict.
Well, let's go to something much deeper. Again, going back to the article, Professor Lewis, this is what you wrote, and I quote, I want to get your further explanation. Even as some people resist, authorities impose Russian education, cultural indoctrination, and economic and legal system to rope this land ever more tightly to Russia. Now, I think let's go back to this fundamental question. When it comes to word ideology, or when it comes to the word cultural indoctrination, what is the correlation that we bring those two concepts into our conversation when we look at the war in Ukraine? I mean, we understand it's the major conflict, it's the military, again, what we say conflict and or major military competition. But when it comes to ideology, when it comes to cultural indoctrination, what are the important elements we need to understand as we're looking in the year of 2024?
So there's obviously a big geopolitical element to this conflict about the West, about Russia, about European security. But there's also this really important, as you say, ideological and cultural element, which is really about identity. It's about identity politics. What does it mean to be Russian? What does it mean to be Ukrainian? Is there a separate Ukrainian people, a separate Ukrainian nation that has its own Ukrainian state? Many Russians, including Vladimir Putin, think that Russians and Ukrainians are, as he puts it, one people, so one nation. Ukrainians, of course, disagree and say we're a separate nation and we have a separate state and that has sovereignty. And between those two clashes of sort of political projects and ideologies, you have the outcome on the ground, which is Russia's intensive Russification policy in the occupied territories, imposing Russian language on Ukrainian schools, often destroying sort of Ukrainian cultural heritage, and imposing all the sort of Russian cultural and ideological aspects, changing museums, changing art galleries, all the kind of what you might call soft power aspects. Russia is changing culture, but through force, through military means, of course, and through political coercion and control. So that's important to remember when we're not just looking at the military aspect here, we're looking at this really important cultural and ideological clash that you can see really being implemented on the ground in these occupied territories.
Well, but going back to the question, Professor Lewis, so what does that mean to be a Russian citizen today? I mean, again, I believe that if we read Vladimir Putin carefully, it's all about the word loyalty. So in other words, again, if you're a Russian citizen, you know that according to his ideology or according to his, I would say, propaganda, that fighting against Ukraine, it's basically to protect this whole motherland. So in other words, we need to be unified all together. But meanwhile, again, going back to the question, how much do all the Russians today actually understand that there are so many loopholes, or even this is just propagandistic statement like coming out of the Kremlin? So in other words, you cannot just randomly invade another country, or you cannot use false claim or false ideology to brainwash people and to believe that you're doing the right thing in order to save the people or in order to save the world. So going back to the question, what is the real identity to be Russian today as we look at the war, or especially look at the political rhetoric under Vladimir Putin?
Well, of course, it's very complex, like any identity. You've got Russians who clearly do understand that the war is illegal. They understand Ukraine is a separate state. But you also have quite a large part of the population that seems to agree with elements of the Russian ideology and with Putin's view of Ukraine, because that is what is promoted on Russian television, in Russian propaganda, and that Russian messaging and Russian media control has been very effective at influencing people's opinions. So you have a very, in some ways, quite a polarized society in Russia between those who are pro and anti-war, and also a sort of middle ground of people who are just, if you like, trying to survive and keep their heads down and get through as best they can. But Russian leadership has been quite successful at essentially manipulating information, manipulating history in particular, a very strong emphasis on so-called patriotic history. And in that sort of history, it's now taught in schools, Ukraine really doesn't exist, doesn't have a place in that history as an independent state or as an independent subject. So that has been what Russia's been very effective at, is convincing Russians that somehow, or at least some Russians, that this war is justified, even though, of course, in legal terms, it clearly isn't. And I think the other problem is that Russians simply don't know, often Russians don't know that much about Ukraine. The older generation, of course, traveled there a lot. There are a lot of connections. In the last decade in particular, fewer Russians have traveled there. There's much more Russian propaganda about Ukraine. Whereas Ukraine has been changing very quickly in the last 20 years into a nation and a state which has a much stronger national identity. And many Russians simply haven't noticed, if you like, that change and the importance of that change in the last few years, and particularly among a younger generation of Ukrainians who now see the world in very different ways. They're much more pro-European, much less interested in Russia and Russian culture, much more interested in European and Western sort of culture. So that big change is one that Russians haven't really experienced at first hand.
Professor Lewis, let's talk about this occupied territories. Now, again, going back to the article that you mentioned, Russia now runs all the telecommunications and internet networks in the annexed oblast, so many Ukrainian news sites are blocked. Now, we know that today online communication is so vital and critical. Now, by manipulating this telecommunication and also the internet networks, I know most people will probably ask you the question is it effective? But allow me to ask another way. Maybe we can open up an even bigger conversation is, I believe by manipulating telecommunications and internet networks, that does show some sorts of insecurity of the Russian government. So in other words, they're so worried, that they're so afraid that this online world could be one of the loopholes that if they don't put a control right now, they can lose it, because once people start to communicate, once people communicate with the outside world, that could actually bring a lot more trouble upon the Kremlin or even upon Putin. What do you think of that? So is that a sign of insecurity, or that's really another way for Putin strategically to manage the Ukrainian occupied territory? What do you say to that?
Yes, I mean, Russian leadership often talks about the threat of information warfare against them, as they see it. They see Western media as, they see it wrongly, as a kind of tool of the West, tool of Western governments that's trying to undermine Russian stability and security. And they have discovered inside Russia itself, of course, that they can't really compete in the information landscape if there's a level playing field. And so they've increasingly brought in very repressive laws around media. Most independent media in Russia is now being closed down. Quite strict, very strict penalties for even reposting information about the war that disagrees with the Russian government line. And in the occupied territories, yes, it's become very difficult to access all the Ukrainian sites and Ukrainian news that people used to have. Of course, people can use VPNs and get on information that way. Information comes through, but it becomes more difficult. And on people's television sets now, importantly, you get this package of Russian television channels, which give, obviously, the Russian point of view. And that does, over time, have a little bit of impact, I think, on people's psychology, on people's ideas. And it also emphasizes this idea that Russia wants to put out, which is that Russia is here to stay, right? Russia's interest in these territories is permanent, and it doesn't intend to negotiate them away or somehow leave in the future. And that gives that sort of, again, a psychological effect, I think, of making people, essentially Russia's trying to make people acquiesce in the occupation and not resist its presence on the ground.
When we talk about this psychological effect, of course, for adults, again, as the maturity kicks in, that we understand the information that goes through our mind. So, of course, that we're mature enough to distinguish the right and wrong, and we're able to tell some of the information they're trying to mislead us and some information and should be corrected. But meanwhile, going back to the article, you also mentioned, and I quote, at schools in the Russian-occupied areas, children cannot avoid the propaganda. They are forced to sing the Russian national anthem every week. Schools have completely switched over to using Russian curriculum, with Ukrainian reduced to an optional second language. What is the ultimate goal for a Russian government to do that? We understand for adults, it's you're saying, hey, listen, either my way or highway. We say that in English. But when it comes to children, you change the education curriculum and then you force the children to sing Russian national anthem. Again, the kid's going to grow up. And today, we're not seeing the kids back in the early 30s or 40s. But in the year 2024, one day they are going to wake up. And plus, with the environment, they are going to wake up, and they wake up quickly. So don't you think this is such a strategy is going to backfire exactly what the Russian government are doing? You can't make children to do something they don't want to do. And also that could simultaneously create this, what we called a natural rebellion against the rules. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And obviously it's very hard to tell how that will develop, except from being there on the ground. But I do think Russia's idea, at least, is, of course, to socialize young people as early as possible, to make them essentially, again, normalize this Russian education. That includes teaching Russian history, right, with that particular propagandistic element to it. Really removing all sorts of Ukrainian culture and history from the curriculum and replacing them with Russian. So what they're trying to do is create good, patriotic Russian citizens, as it were, out of these young Ukrainian children. Also taking these children on study tours of Russia, taking them to Moscow, St. Petersburg, to show them, if you like, the tourist sites of Russia and so on. So it's an intensive program to try and Russify these young children. Now, you might be right that some of them will rebel. Even inside Russia, we know that some of this patriotic education doesn't really go down very well with teenagers. They're not very keen on going to these patriotic education classes and so forth. And there's quite a lot of cynicism and skepticism about it. But nevertheless, I think Russia will count on the idea that over time, if not everybody, at least a majority of young people will sort of go along with this idea and will end up going to Russia to university and will effectively be part of that Russian culture, Russian political system. Now, I might be wrong. There might be more rebellious elements as well that will come forward in the future. I think it's very difficult to say, but that's certainly the Russian plan.
Professor Lewis, two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about the attitude from Ukraine right now. If I'm not mistaken, I remember last year, Christmas time, on social media, the current Ukrainian President Zelensky shared or should we say several, strong uplifting messages through social media. Again, to sum up, he used a lot of strong emotional words, for example, unity, for example, democracy, and also the spirit of never giving up. Again, we understand from his perspective, he sent a strong signal not only to the citizens of Ukraine, but also the citizens of the world, particularly for the countries that were still questioned or even in this limbo position. Should they continue to support Ukraine financially or militarily whatsoever? But meanwhile, right now, again, going back to the article, your article is called Quiet Transformation of Occupied Ukraine right now. Is there anything at this moment for these occupied territories to fight back in order to resist, in order to see much greater changes? I mean, again, ultimately, I talk to people across the aisles that they all believe the Russian, it's not going anywhere, and Putin is not going anywhere. So we probably know the result of the war. But right now, it's not just about sending the aids and sending the resources to Ukraine, but also continue for the occupied territories to fight back. Do we see any strategies? Do we see any hope for the Ukrainians to fight against the power at this moment?
It is very difficult, and I think part of the problem, of course, is that some people, certainly in Kiev and in some Western capitals, thought there would be a successful counteroffensive in 2023, and in that way, some of this territory would be retaken by Ukrainian forces. But obviously, we didn't see that happen on the ground, and so you've had this opportunity really for Russia to intensify its control in the occupied territories, and there are only a small number of sort of opportunities, if you like, to push back on that. Obviously, sanctions is one. A lot of people are sanctioned who are working in those territories. It's a kind of disincentive. Longer term, the cost of these territories might turn out to be a difficulty for Russia, but at the moment, they're spending about $10 billion a year on these annexed territories, but that is not really prohibitive for Russia. That's within the bounds of what they can afford, I think. And then there may well be more armed resistance, of course, in the occupied territories. There have been quite regular assassination attempts, particularly against so-called collaborators or pro-Russian individuals in the local Russian administrations, and against some Russian officers and soldiers. But for the most part, Russia's been, I think, able to contain that kind of armed resistance. Remember, it's very experienced in counterinsurgency from Chechnya, from Syria, from other wars. And so dealing with that kind of internal resistance, at least so far, has been something that Russia's been able to do. So it does depend much more on both on the military situation, but also on the prospect for any kind of political negotiations down the line. But at the moment, at least, Russia's position has been that they're not willing to give up any of this territory in negotiations. And so they will only do so if they're under military, political and economic pressure in the future. So, yes, at the moment, it looks as though we have a period, at least, when there won't be much change territorially, and the focus might shift to other areas of the war, and of course to the political side and the diplomatic side as well.
Professor Lewis, I want to ask you the last question. Let's talk about, again, towards the end part of the article. This is something you wrote, and I quote, Ukrainian policymakers had hoped that a quick and a successful military counteroffensive last year would free the territories and roll back Russian forces. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass. As the war grinds on, Russia has time to further consolidate its political, economic, and administrative occupation, making the eventual reintegration of these territories back into Ukraine increasingly difficult. Now, as we mentioned before, right now, I believe most of the countries, or even not most, but some countries are experiencing what we called this war fatigue, or even what we called support fatigue, because we don't see the war is going anywhere, but meanwhile, we know Russia is not giving up. Ukraine is facing much greater difficulty moving forward. So what is the hope for the country, or what is the immediate solution? I mean, again, we know that today, particularly for the U.S., it's standing at the crossroads when we talk about continue to offer supply to Ukraine, and also the West is seeking much greater partnership in order to deal with Vladimir Putin or even Kremlin at the same time. So your final thoughts, what do you think of that? Are we seeing any hope for the war? Are we seeing any changes or immediate changes very soon? Or this is just a waiting game? And surely no one would like to see the war drag on until the December of 2024. Your final thoughts.
I think sort of international sentiment around the war has sort of gone up and down over time. You've had optimistic periods, pessimistic periods. I think it's good to sort of balance things out a bit and point to both the positives and the negatives. And certainly we've had this difficulty of getting funding to Ukraine from both European Union and from the US. But now we have a European Union package in place at least. So I think support will continue, regardless of these sort of stories of Ukraine fatigue. I think Ukraine will have to focus a lot on making sure it doesn't lose more territory, of course. So in other words, a much more defensive position. But that in itself, I think, can be seen as a success to maintain the pressure on Russia, and also to maintain the pressure on Russia in the maritime field and in the air as well. But my own feeling is at some point there will have to be a negotiation. What that will look like is very hard to say. There's no real sign that Russia wants to negotiate at the present, and no real sign that Ukraine is willing to make any concessions, of course. But that does mean that I suspect that come December 2024, the war still will be going on in some form at least. And unfortunately, I can't see an early end to it at the moment, unless we see some major changes on either side or indeed within Russia itself. Remember, Russia is also under a lot of pressure in this war, economically, politically. There's a lot of social tensions around the very high number of deaths, the economic costs, and so forth. So this is still quite an unpredictable situation, even though for some people from outside, it looks as though we're in a kind of stalemate. Actually, there's a lot of dynamic factors still going on. Things could change a lot during the year. But I'd be quite surprised, I'm afraid, to see an end to the war before the end of the year. And it means that those occupied territories will still be under Russian control, probably, and Russia will be able to consolidate its control. But as I say, things are very unpredictable, and predicting the future of this war in the past has often led us to quite significant mistakes. But as I say, it is a very difficult situation, particularly for people living under the occupation. And we'll see, perhaps, I think, during the year, a shift towards more diplomatic, more political initiatives to try and win back, if you like, the momentum for Ukraine, and win back sort of Ukrainian control of the sort of international agenda as well, which has slipped away a little bit in the last few months.
Indeed, Professor Lewis, it is rather difficult to predict the outcome of the war. Of course, that no one would like to see that war continues, because which means that more citizens will continue to suffer in the midst of the war. And of course, that will basically add additional financial and also military, we would say even political pressure upon the international community. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Professor David Lewis. Again, Professor Lewis is a professor of global politics, and he teaches and researches on international relations and peace and conflict studies, with additional strands of research focused on the politics of authoritarian states. And I strongly encourage everyone go online, connect with Professor Lewis, and check out his amazing article, which is entitled "The Quiet Transformation of Occupied Ukraine." Well, Professor Lewis, I thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.